But it is Sam knows. So thanks for joining, everyone. Apologies if you joined the previous session, which had a slight technical issue. I won't spend too long on some of the other bits that we ran through. I will cover them off today. A reminder that there is a second session on the reporting interface, which is available in 2 weeks' time. And there is a optional third session, which looks at the Explore functionality in GA4. If you're interested in that one, if you email myself, Steve, or Sam after today, we can look at getting you booked in on that as well. There is a Q&A functionality up at the top. Feel free to use that to ask questions. If you've got questions on your own specific GA4 account, though, or you want to ask something privately, feel free to reach out to me directly after today's session. Okay. So this session is all about getting to know GA4. So we're going to be looking at the different data model, a number of things that have changed throughout the interface, and some of the things you need to be aware of when looking at your own GA4 account. There is the chat feature. I will refer to Universal Analytics UA as Google Analytics 3 or GA3, and I'll probably refer to GA4 and Google Analytics 4 interchangeably as well. We'll make sure you get a copy of these slides in PDF format after today's session. And as I mentioned just at the beginning, there is a follow-up session already booked for reporting in GA4, but there's also the Explore training as well available, should you be interested in that functionality. Okay, so an introduction to GA4. That's why we're here today. On the 1st of July this year, Universal Analytics, the one we've been using for the last 20 years or so, will stop collecting new data for your site unless you pay for Google 360. If you're a 360 customer, you've got an extension of 6 months to still use Universal Analytics alongside GA4. Now, some people are embracing GA4 more than others. I will say it is a learning curve because of how much of a change it is, but it's actually got some pretty cool features and functionality in there. So there's nothing to be scared of. We're going to look at what it is, what it isn't, and also look at some of the history. When it comes to the history, it's partly because I hope you'll allow me to be a little bit nerdy. There's a bit of a self-indulgence there, but it's to help you understand how far Google Analytics has come, where it began, and why we've now moved to GA4. So I won't dwell on these too much. We covered these in the last one, but there have been 4 big releases for GA4, and these are grouped by code bases. The first one is Urchin. Urchin was the platform that Google bought back in 2005. It was originally released in 1998 as a web platforming bandwidth billing tool. You then got Urchin by Google. You then got Google Analytics synchronous and asynchronous code, the analytics tag, and the one we're probably most familiar with is the global site tag, the G tag. Good thing with the G tag is if you have that on your site already, it's very easy to make the transition to Google Analytics 4. That's just a little visual representation for you as to how far it's come. Google loves a logo redesign as well as a platform redesign. Won't spend too much time on that as we covered that last time. But one of the things that hasn't changed in the last 20 years is UTM, and I'm sure you probably all use these as part of your campaign performance. If you're ever doing email or social media, you'll have used Source Medium Campaign quite frequently. Probably the one thing to note is that UTM actually stands for Urchin Traffic Monitor. So the Urchin system that Google purchased back in 2005, this is where it came from. So what is GA4? That's why we're all here. It started life in beta form in App and WebView, and as the name suggests, it was designed as a singular platform that would allow you to track users across your website or websites and across various apps, whether that's on Android, Windows, Mac, or on Google. The idea was it would be a lot more seamless, and it was another Google acquisition, much like Urchin. There's a number of things it changes quite significantly, though. So Universal Analytics, how we've been used to reporting in analytics for a long time, has all been about sessions and being session-based. With Google Analytics 4, everything is an event, even a session. So you're now on event-based reporting. There's a lot more inbuilt privacy controls in Google Analytics 4, including cookieless management. Cookies are still there, but you have to agree to Google's terms of service that you're using them in the correct way and make your users clear on them. But there is cookieless ways to measure and track users, providing you inform them. There's also enhanced predictiveness. So Google started introducing AI insights into Universal Analytics a couple of years ago. They've gradually gotten better over time. In GA4, they're even more useful. And the other thing to note is it's a lot more easily integrated into other platforms that Google manage. So this is the view that you'll be used to seeing in analytics. A bunch of reports on the left made readily available, and then you've got your chart and table on the right. You'll be familiar with how they're grouped together: real-time, audience, acquisition, behavior, conversions, and your customizations. At first glance in GA4, you notice that things aren't too different, but there are some significant changes there, and the grouping is now grouped into snapshot and real-time, lifecycle reporting, and user reporting. Don't worry, we're going to look at all of these, particularly when we get to the reporting session, which follows in 2 weeks' time. Today is probably going to be about how to use the interface and the various account settings you need to be mindful of when setting up your own Google Analytics 4 accounts. So right at the start, we're going to look at account structure. You'll probably be used to seeing organization, which is an optional layer of control you can have. Your account, which would generally have multiple properties in. Underneath your properties, you would have multiple views. It's quite standard. We're quite used to that in Universal Analytics. And you'd probably have different views. One would be a master view, one would be a testing, one would be raw, so you wouldn't have any filtering or manipulations in there. And you might have one that's just for developers, internal traffic, or specific countries. In GA4, you don't have multiple views anymore. You have a single view for your account instead. And the way it's structured is similar, but instead of views, you have data streams. So you still have your account, you still have your properties, but then underneath each property, you have a data stream. So you would have a data stream for your website. You might have a data stream for an iOS app. You might have one for a Google Android app. If you have multiple sites, multiple domains, you may have multiple data streams there as well. Now, there's a couple of things you will want to check in your property settings. So underneath each of these pictures, we've included the shortcuts to where to go and find these bits of information. But in your property settings, you'll be looking at things like your property name, so what you want to call your property. Given the fact that people are still using Universal Analytics and will be until the data is deleted, keeping the GA4 name in there is probably going to be helpful for you. You'll also have your industry category. I would say on industry category, the list of industries that you can choose from is very, very limited. So choose the one that's closest matching to your industry and choose that. You also have a reporting time zone and your currency. I wouldn't change those after they're set unless you need to, but if you do need to change them, do it before July, so that come July, you've got a fresh set of data in there. There's two types of ID for each of your for your accounts. One is property ID, the other is measurement ID. Property ID is just a unique identifier for your property, and it's in the exact same place when you go to admin and property settings, but it's just over in the right-hand side there. It's going to be 9 numbers. It won't change. You're unlikely to need it. It's just be mindful that this is not the one you want to use if you're ever doing any measurements or any work through Tag Manager. If you're doing any work in Tag Manager, what you'll need is your measurement ID. So your measurement ID is a unique identifier for your web data stream. So as I mentioned a couple of slides ago, you have a data stream for each of your sites or each of your apps if you have them. And each measurement ID is listed there. Will be formatted with a G in front, a hyphen, and then the numbers. It's a very, very small thing, but the fact that you can easily copy from the interface now is a small but very good win. It makes it much easier to make sure that you're capturing the right thing. Just be mindful not to use your property ID. Measurement ID is what you want to use if you're using Tag Manager. It's in a slightly different place to find this one. You need to go to Admin, Data Streams, and then choose the data stream you want to fire events into. So in this case, it would be a website. One of the other settings you want to check in Google Analytics 4 is called Enhanced Measurement. Now, because everything in Google Analytics 4 is an event, Google have made it easier to do some event collecting straight out of the box. So page views is an obvious one. You're used to seeing those in Google Analytics. Some of these, however, were things that people were building frequently as custom events in Tag Manager and firing into Universal Analytics. You've probably done some of these yourself. There'll be things like scrolls, clicks to other websites, site search functionality, form interactions, video engagement, and file downloads. Again, you can find these in your data stream, so you need to check that these are turned on for each individual data stream. If you have more than one website, you need to check it in every data stream there. You can turn some of these off if they're not relevant for your business, all except for page views. You need page views to be able to track. We'll come back to some of these settings later on, and although some of them are designed to work out of the box, they don't all fully work yet. And although Google's releasing GA4 in July, things like form interactions needs custom configuration in Tag Manager, and site search works to a degree, but not on every site. It depends whether Google likes how your site search works on site. There are ways to overcome it. We cover that in the reporting session, which follows this as well. The other setting is advisable to check is on your demographic data. So demographic data, it gives you a useful set of metrics on your audience's age, their interest, and their gender. If you're new to GA4 though, and you go into any of the demographic reports, you'll likely see that the information in there is blank. Now, by default, demographic data won't populate in Google Analytics 4, and that's because you need to enable another setting called Google Signals. And Google Signals is another layer of data collection, and you can see that in the admin data settings, data collection tab in the settings. But you have to turn it on, and you have to agree to Google's data collection acknowledgement. There's a little box down here. You can see that you've told customers or users on your site how you're going to use their data. So if you want to see demographic data, please make sure you've got that turned on. There is a slight but with it though. If Google Signals are enabled, rows with small numbers in the reports are likely to be hidden. If you want to use audiences in your Google Ads from your GA4 accounts, you have to turn on Google Signals as well. So there's two scenarios where you'll want to turn this on. The flip side is that you may have some sampling or thresholding applied to your report because it's turned on. It's not retroactive, and it can take 24 to 48 hours before you start seeing data come in. So what we'd always recommend is you need to make the decision now as to whether you want the demographic data in your GA4 accounts and whether you're likely to use your GA4 audience data to help inform your Google Ads targeting. If either of those are yes, get it turned on now, but make sure your privacy policy is updated so users know that you're going to be tracking them from a user perspective. Okay, in data settings, there's a few different tabs you're going to want to look at. One of them is on data collection. So a couple of things to note: no IP address tracking by default. In Universal Analytics, you could see IP addresses unless you manually anonymize them. There is blended data collection for users now in GA4. Users can also request that you delete their data if you are processing it through GA4, and we'll look at how to do that in a moment. You can also choose to turn off location-specific data and add personalization by individual country. So by default in your data settings, all 306 countries that Google Analytics operates in has it turned on, but if you want to turn off data collection for a specific country, you can do. And again, demographics turned off by default, but they can be configured through Google Signals subject to throttling. If you do turn on Google Signals though, your demographics report will end up looking something like this, where you can see the interests used in the last 30 minutes, town, city, age, and by gender. Some of these reports, if you're passing this data into Looker Studio, may show up as unknown, and that'll be people who've either not enabled it or if you've only just turned it on and the data hasn't been collected yet. One of the other areas you'll want to look at is on your data retention. So as well as collecting data, you can select how long you want to collect event data for users. Doesn't mean the data is going to be wiped, but it's user-specific data. Now, you see here at the top, it's going to change the data retention period for data associated with cookies. Cookies is part of this. GA4 can be cookieless, particularly in the way that it uses user IDs. We'll have a look at that in a little bit, but you've effectively got two options here in data retention. By default, it's set to 2 months. You can extend it to 14. It's worth checking. I would always recommend extending it to 14, just making sure that you're making users aware of that fact. If you do have this and people are using cookies, or they've not consented to user IDs, or they're not logged in to a Google account and our personalization, Google will use its AI to fill in the gaps where there are drops in data for users. Change it to 14, fine. I think it's probably, it's just a step in the transition to being fully cookieless. The other section in data you need to consider is data filtering. So filters let you remove information from your report. These could be things like internal developer traffic, it could be internal call centers, it could be people who work remotely. You don't want to see data from them doing things in your reporting. There are two types of data filtering in GA4 by default. One is on data, the other is on report. Report filtering we'll look at in the second session, but a data filter is a permanent effect you're going to apply, and it's more akin to the IP filtering you would have done in Universal Analytics. Slight difference is it's not quite as easy to configure as it was in Universal Analytics. And there you could just specify a range of IP addresses, hit apply, and it would do it. It's why we had multiple views. So you could always see raw data, but then you could also see data that was filtered. You can also do 10 data filters in your account. But as you'll see here, there are only two types of filtering that you can currently do. One is developer traffic. So if you have a developer who is testing things on your site, you wouldn't want that data to be tracked in your reports. The other is internal traffic. So if you have internal traffic from a customer service center, you may want to filter that as well. Internal traffic may inflate your engagement metrics. At the same time, if you have internal traffic who are selling online, you would want to see that. Developer traffic, although you wouldn't want to necessarily see it in the reports, you would still want the developers to be able to see changes that they're making and any testing that they're doing in Tag Manager. So internal traffic, as I mentioned, you could just specify the IP addresses to exclude and hit apply, and it would do that for you. GA4, not quite as easy to do. What you first need to do is identify and tell Google what the internal traffic is. And because everything is an event, you need to configure it as an event. Effectively, you're creating an event for traffic types here, specifying the IP address that's going to be identified as traffic type equals internal. And then you can turn the event on and it will start filtering it out that way. As I mentioned there, you identify the internal traffic with the traffic type parameter for every incoming event. You can filter it that way. And then you've got the option to test it, turn it to active, or make it inactive. So if it's in testing, analytics will identify any data that matches the test data name and just mark it as being in testing. If it's active, it'll apply it to the incoming data and it will make permanent changes. If it's inactive, analytics won't use the filter at all. Developer traffic, slightly different. I've been asked this one quite a few times, why you wouldn't have a split between them, and I'll cover that on the next slide. But developer traffic, although you don't want it in your reports, you want to be able to see whether things are working. If developers or as marketeers, if we're deploying new tags, new events and triggers, we want to be able to see if it's populating correctly in the Analytics 4 interface before we hit apply to it. Any filters you do and changes you make may be permanent, they aren't retroactive, But if you're permanently altering your data, you want to make sure you've got it right first. So what developer traffic can be done is you can also set it to testing active and inactive, but the developer traffic will apply debug events parameters to any work being done. That basically means that the developers can go into the settings, go to debug view, and they can see the events that are firing, the clicks, the page views, any triggering events that they've configured in Tag Manager, and they'll be able to see what parameters are being passed through, when they're firing, and if they're landing in the account correctly. It's an important distinction to make. Developers need to be able to see what they're doing. Internal traffic doesn't. So if you're wondering why you wouldn't just use the internal traffic filter, that's the reason. Developers need to be able to see what they're doing, what they're testing. Internal traffic, not necessarily so. But with internal traffic, you also need to consider whether if internal traffic can actually transact or generate conversions or goals on your site, you wouldn't necessarily want to block them from doing that. And debug view looks a little like this. So the middle stream here, you can see it's generating the events logged in the last 60 seconds. It's done by minutes. And you can see there was user engagement, view item list, and scroll. The left-hand column is the series of events in the last 30 minutes. And the right-hand column is the list of top events in a 30-minute period and the user properties that are currently active. So debug view is the place where your developers are going to, it's like a test environment basically. And the developers will be able to see what they're testing in here before they apply it and filter anything through to your account and permanently change your data. And one of the other questions we get asked quite a lot about with filtering, and it's one you could easily do in Universal Analytics, was create filters for bot traffic. I'm sure we've all experienced huge spikes of bot traffic over the last decade or so. You used to be able to create your own filters if that was the case to remove it from your reports. It's not possible in GA4. GA4 blocks bots and spiders automatically. There's no way to currently do it individually, and Google won't give you a list of bot traffic that it's identified. It is done on a international basis though. It's just something to be mindful of. You don't get to see this list anymore or apply manual bot changes yourself, filtering. So there's 3 types of filtering, just keep those in mind. You probably need to consider whether you want to block your internal traffic. Let's say if your business uses internal teams on the site to generate leads or conversions, you probably don't want to block it. Developers need to be set up for debug view, and you won't be able to manually block bot traffic itself either. One of the other things you'll be able to do is, it's a relatively newer, but it's a more advanced feature, is data import. So if you wanted to explore your internal customer data and you wanted to match it up with data you store in analytics for your users, you could upload the data yourself. It is rather limited. At the minute, you can only upload cost, item, user data by user ID or client ID, and offline event data. So if you were tracking in your customer databases whether someone had purchased something over regularly, or if they're a regular customer, or if they're a specific type of customer, they're in different tiers, you could append that to users in GA4. Now, there is an element of legality here, as users would need to be logged in. You'd have to identify customers, and your privacy policy would need updating to reflect the fact that you're using their data in this way. So if you are going to explore this in more detail, you need to make sure that your compliance team have made it clear that your privacy policy is updated and clearly communicates how that data is going to be used online. As I say, it's a very limited amount of data that you can import at the minute, and you have to do the manually matching yourself. So it's quite a big project to undertake. It might be one worth exploring when GA4 settles down a bit. I have a slight feeling that GA4 is going to be still classed as in beta, although it's going to be released in July, given the fact that 360 customers have got an extension of 6 months or so. They won't be making the switch for a while yet. Now, data deletion. We touched on this one a couple of times before, but effectively a data deletion request, you can collect event parameters for anyone who requests it. So you just go schedule data deletion requests and it will be replaced in your reporting with data deleted. So it's a permanent action. Someone requests the data about them be deleted, you can do. You need to have editor or administrator roles within the GA4 account in order to do it. I will be mindful of not giving anyone who has access to your GA4 account the ability to do it. Limit who has editor and admin access. For instance, if you have a third-party agency working for you, you may not want them to do it. They may need it if they're helping you with setting up GA4 or firing events, but you can demote their access afterwards. You can only do 25 of these data deletion requests in any one time, but there is a 7-day cooling off period. So if you were to schedule a data deletion request, you have 7 days after you create it to delete it. I'm not sure how many people would change their mind, but the option's there, or if the wrong person has been scheduled in, again, why you would only let certain people be able to do it. But you can delete it if you need to. And you can find that in admin property settings and data deletion requests. If you have a privacy team who are concerned about data protection, letting them know that there is this functionality there may be quite beneficial for you as well. Reporting identity is another area we've touched on very briefly. So although we have been talking about how GA4 is helping people go cookieless, 2 reasons. One is the change to iOS with turning off tracking by default. One is GDPR. People are gradually moving over to a cookieless world. GA4 has been built to stitch together sessions based on a number of different user types. And by default, it's set to blended. So you can basically choose whether you want to do it unobserved, where you set user ID, or you can choose blended, where Google will work through it in a hierarchical order. So it'll look to see if a user has a user ID. If it doesn't, it'll look to see whether you've got Google signals enabled and the user has agreed to personalized ad data. If it doesn't, it'll go to device ID. And device ID on web will be client ID, and on app, it will be app instance ID. Now, if you don't have an app and you're only working on a website, as I'm sure probably some of you are, you'll see lots of references to apps in GA4. You can't hide them. GA4 by default is just set to being web and app view. So there'll be some terminology that isn't relevant. You just have to accept that it's not the case. User ID is the most accurate form, and it can support you in identifying users across multiple devices and browsers. But if you go with the blended route, which is set to by default, Google will do its job for you, and it'll use the modeling to try and fill in the gaps where it can't do it. And it will choose the best ID per user as it works its way through. Now, the look back window is again where you can choose how far back in time a touch point is eligible for attribution credit. So if you're running paid search activity, or you're running paid social activity, or even organic social activity, you may want to change some of these look back windows for conversion events. For acquisition conversion events, that's going to be things like first open if it's an app, or first visit if it's a website. The default recommended look back window is 30 days. If you wanted to, you could change that to 7 days. I would say 30 days is more than satisfactory. For all other conversion events, you're going to be looking back at the recommended look back window of 90 days. You can change that to 30 or 60 if you have different needs, but it will apply that look back window to any attribution model. And you can see at the top there, you've got different attribution models that you can take. Again, it's set to cross-channel data-driven. It'll only apply changes to future data. It'll change the data permanently as well. Again, I would recommend going into your admin property settings and attribution settings ahead of July, making any changes you want to make there now, because it will permanently affect the data and it will apply it to all future data. It won't apply it retroactively. Now, this is probably the biggest section we're going to look at for what's different within GA4. and it's the data model and events, and it will be why it's not so easy to compare between GA4 and Universal Analytics, and why the numbers will look different. So the data model is probably the biggest area, and the major difference is how it collects and processes the website data. Universal Analytics uses a measurement model based on sessions and page views, and sessions will link data to a single individual and track them specifically as they go through the site. GA4 is purely an event-based model to track data. The event data is pretty anonymous unless you've enabled Google Signals or you're using user ID from imported data. And the importance is placed on the actions that a user takes per event. So for each event, you can apply different parameters to it, and you can collect up to 25 of those for each event that's fired. So in UA, the data collection model relied on hit types, as we've covered off. It was session and page view based, but you could have things fire such as page view, events, social hits, transactions, user timing. Those all contained data to populate the dimensions and the metrics in your UA reporting. In contrast, all of those hit types that you're used to seeing in Universal Analytics are now considered events. Page view is an event is an event, a social hit is an event, transactions an event, user timing an event, even a session is an event in GA4. It's quite a big change. It's something you need to be mindful of, and it's why comparing page views, transaction hits, or even session data isn't advisable. They're all completely different now, and if you go into GA4 knowing that everything is an event, it's going to help you considerably. Knowing that you can't compare quite so easily is also quite key. So you might be thinking, if everything's an event in GA4, can we use the events that we have in Universal Analytics? Events in UA, they were created within Tag Manager, and there were 4 parameters that you could have. So you had event category, action, label, and value. And it was quite hierarchical. So the category held the action held the label contained the value. You could click into those and you could build events out quite easily, but it was quite restrictive and it had to be done quite manually as well. They don't have a like for like in GA4 either. So this is probably the best example that we've used with clients. You might have a category of navigation. So I could go into my events in Universal Analytics, click on navigation as a category. The action underneath that will be a navigational click, and the label might be click text. And that event in Universal Analytics would help me see what people are clicking on from drop-down navigation, footer navigation, and it would be configured within Tag Manager. It was all stepped. It was quite simple. It's quite basic. In Google Analytics 4, you build events in Google Tag Manager, but instead of being category, action, and label, you now have your event name, and then you have parameter, and you can have up to 25 of those parameters per event. I wouldn't necessarily recommend having 25 parameters. It can get quite difficult to track, but you can choose the parameter name and the value that's collected with it. They are much more flexible. So rather than being stepped, you've just got your event name and then the parameters all sit alongside each other. And you can see these in Google Analytics 4 very easily. As I've put 4 there as an example, just to give you the idea of how they work. And again, you might be thinking they're not too dissimilar. So in UA, you had event, category, action, label, GA, event, parameter. There is a bit of added complexity with GA4 in the fact that there are 4 types of events collected. These are automatically collected events. There's enhanced measurement events. So if you remember back in the early slides, we talked about those and how we come back to them. There's a list of recommended events, and there's custom events. Can't go into too much of custom events, but if there's something that doesn't fit automatic, enhanced, or recommended, you would create a custom event from that. So there's already some complexity with your events, and I appreciate it's not going to necessarily be easy to work out what each one is. So we're going to look at them in a bit of detail. The first set is your automatically collected events, and as the name suggests, they're collected automatically. You don't need to do anything for them. it's just set up automatically, it's running for you. The first one is an event called session start, and it's an event that's fired when a user first launches a session. It replaces the sessions metric from Universal Analytics. So if we ever talk about the fact that sessions either don't exist or aren't comparable anymore, this is partly why sessions are now counted on an event, and the event is session start. And session start can also happen without a page view now, because events are your bread and butter in GA4. The other automatically collected event is first visit. So it's the event that's fired when a user is identified as new, and that replaces new users from Universal Analytics. And then user engagement is an automatically collected event as well. And there's a couple of metrics that fall under that, parameters that fall under that. That'll be very useful, but that user engagement event will only fire if the user has been on your page for 10 seconds, viewed 2 or more pages, or has completed a conversion event. It's new for GA4. We'll look at some of the benefits to it in more detail later on. But I think the one thing to keep in mind is user engagement is a much more positive metric compared to the likes of things like bounce rates, which we're used to in Universal Analytics, and also something like average session duration. So sessions can automatically expire after 30 minutes, but just because they can expire in 30 minutes doesn't mean that a user's active for that entire duration in UA. User engagement is much more improved in GA4. So enhanced measurement events in GA4, we touched on these earlier. Some of these you can turn off, some of them you can't. Page views is the one that you can't. Some of them do need a little bit of configuration, but what these will do is they'll fire specific events with parameters into your account. And we'll look at these in detail. So page view is triggered each time the page loads in the browser or the history state is changed. It's automatically collected, you can't turn it off. And it'll populate page location and page referrer, so where they came from and where they are. Scroll as an event is triggered the first time a user reaches the bottom of each page. For instance, 90% scroll depth when someone gets to the bottom. Quite useful to see if people are scrolling all of your content. If they're not, you may want to move call to actions further up. Click will trigger each time a user clicks a link, and that'll include link classes, link domain, link ID, link URL, and outbound. Now, view search results is triggered each time a user performs a site search, and is indicated by a URL query parameter. So there's 5 set by default. Your query parameter may be slightly different. What you want to do is have a look on your site, run a site search, and see what the query parameter is, and that will be the letter, or it'll be the word that follows the question mark. It'll be and the equal sign. Typically, it'll be QS search query or keyword, and what it'll do using the search term parameter is it'll populate the dimension for you. It's quite helpful to understand what people are searching for on your site. It can give you an indication whether the navigation isn't right, the UX isn't working, or if people are struggling to find certain things. If that's the case, you can make more informed decisions about changing the structure of your navigation or moving things further around on the homepage. We've done this with a few clients recently. I would say with the search results report or events in GA4, it doesn't work in every account. And it's one of the quirks that's acknowledged by a lot of people in GA4. There is a way around it, and that's in the Explore report that populates all of the search terms being generated for the site. So if you're interested in getting something like that set up, message myself or Steve after the session for the 3rd GA4 training session, where we drill down into the Explore and build out one of the view search results explorations. File download is another one that's really useful to have. So again, as I mentioned earlier on, this was something you used to have to configure in Tag Manager yourself. But now GA4 will do it out of the box, and a lot of file extensions are included. So things like PDFs, documents, text files, CSVs. If you've got programs that people can download, they can track that. Even things like PowerPoints, films, or if there's music. So those will all be collected automatically, really useful. And then you've also got form start and form submit, and you can use those to see how many users are starting to fill out a form and how many are not. This is another one that's not fully configured correctly as of yet. It needs a little bit of manual configuration in Tag Manager to get it working correctly, but the option is there. And then the last section of enhanced measurement events in GA4 are video start, video progress, and video complete. So if you are producing video content or you've got video content already on your site, these are going to really help you understand what people are working with. They're not groundbreaking, but they are helpful to see already in the interface, and it will allow you to match those events being triggered based on user type or where people are coming from. So being able to see those on site outside of Vimeo or outside of YouTube is pretty useful. So those are the enhanced measurement events in GA4. In terms of recommended events, as the name suggests, they're what Google recommends and what they think will be relevant for your business. They're not automatically configured, you need to manually do them, but there'll be things like login, i.e. when a user logs in, purchase if a user completes purchase, refund, search, share, sign up. Things like adding payment info, shipping info, add to cart, wish list, begin checkout, generate lead, remove from cart, and select item. Now, they're not all particularly relevant. There are some others there, and there are some that are specific to apps. There is a full list available on Google's help section. What I would say is find the one that's most relevant or most accurate. So the one we've been using a lot for clients is generate leads. So if you have a contact form on your site, or you have a quote request form, or you have a contact form for a showroom or a branch, you might use something like that, generate lead. It may not be exactly right, but it's a recommended one. I would slot into that and then add your parameters that are relevant. Selecting item might be if you've got a number of different options to choose from. So if you were selling 3 levels of insurance cover, you might do select item for tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. The cart ones are going to be very specific on depending whether you have a shopping journey enabled for the site. There are some specific to apps. I've not listed them here. Now, custom events, as the name suggests, are custom. The only thing Google really says on these is to work your way through the different types of events first. So can the event you want to create be covered in the automatically collected events? The answer is no. Go to enhanced measurement. If it's collected in enhanced measurement or as close to as it can, use one of those. If not, use the recommended events. If you can't use one of those, then create one custom from scratch. There are a few things to remember. You can add up to 25 parameters and they can be used multiple times. So if you do create a custom event, you can store 25 different bits of data to help you understand what people are doing with that event. There are some event collection limits, and you need to make sure that your custom event isn't a reserved event name. And the reserved event names are these ones. And they should be pretty obvious as to why. It's because a lot of these are what people are already pulling up from the recommended events and the enhanced measurement events. So clicks, file downloads, first open, form start, video. You try and create a custom event with these, you'll get an error message from analytics and you have to create something else. Don't start them with a underscore either. You need to start them with a word, but just keep those in mind. Those are reserved event names. So we've touched on events there. There's not a great deal of comparison between events in GA4 and Universal Analytics. In Universal Analytics, we used events to track micro interactions, things like file downloads, which are now automatically collected as events, but everything is an event in GA4. So it's not truly comparable, but every event now has a series of parameters attached to it. And we're going to look at parameters now. So event parameters provide you additional information about the events being sent. Think of them as event actions and labels, but not as restrictive. They are much more flexible. They sit alongside one another. You can have up to 25 event parameters per event. And parameters are made up of two components. One is the name. It wants to be unique, descriptive, help you categorize, be dimension-based. They'll be generally text. And as we covered off with event names, there are some parameter names that you can't use yourself because they're already set by Google as default. The parameter values, you'll want to generally be variable, and they'll populate data based on the trigger and event location that you're creating in Tag Manager. You can make the value static if you wanted it just to be a dimension. It very much depends on the event that you're creating. So as we covered there, parameters are bits of data attached to your events. Google will always include 5 parameters by default. Slight hiccup with this is these 5 parameters take up your collection of 25 as well. So in reality, you only have 20 parameters that you can append to each event because language, page location, page referrer, page title, and screen resolution will always be collected for automatic recommended and custom events anyway. And these will just help you identify where people are coming from when the event took place, where they were prior to the event happening, and the title tag. So the title tags is probably the most tedious bit of SEO to do. And as SEO marketeers, we always bang on about how title tags need to be unique for individual pages. And one of the reasons for that in GA4 is that if Google is collecting the title tags for your events that you're firing, you want to make sure that it's collecting them on unique page titles and not just having identical page titles across multiple pages. Now, some of the other limitations you need to be mindful of when you're collecting parameters is that they need to be about 40 characters or less, otherwise they'll be cut off. If you create a custom parameter that's text-based, then you need to create it as a custom dimension. So dimensions will be text-based. So if you want it to appear in GA4 as a report, in your reports, you need to set those custom dimensions there. Use lower text for names and separate them with an underscore. So there is a bad example here in Google's demo account, and you can see those in admin custom definitions, but you can see how these are set up here. So you've got your dimension name, title, URL, referrer, scope it is, whether it's user or event based, user parameter or parameter when it was changed, and you can add description. I would always add a description to any parameters that you're creating or custom definitions for your parameters. It's just going to help you manage them a lot better, or if someone else goes into the account and wants to see what dimensions you set up. And your parameter values. So if you have a parameter value of specific URL, for instance, just be mindful that it may cut off after 100 characters. So you don't want to make those too long. Custom parameter values being numerical based, and you must create a custom metric for those. And that's in the tab next to custom dimensions. So they're in your custom definitions, and then you've got custom dimensions there and custom metrics there. Don't set parameter values as dimensions. It's always worth checking that you've got them the right way around. Your values will be your metrics, and your dimensions will be your definitions. A couple of things to note with your parameter values. The following parameter names cannot be used. Again, they should be pretty obvious. The engagement time is going to measure how long someone was engaged on the site. So that's when it's active in your tab or window. Gclid is always reserved because that will identify paid search traffic for you. And session ID and session number, for these reasons, it's tracking sessions. Additionally, parameter names cannot begin with an underscore. You can't use Firebase, GA, Google, or GTag either. Those should all be pretty self-explanatory. The underscore is just for making it easy to manage, but Firebase is the platform that GA4 was built on. Google purchased it, rebranded it. It's effectively Google, but in its previous iteration, much as Urchin was the original version of Google Analytics itself. So I appreciate that's probably quite a lot to take in terms of events and how they're different compared to Universal Analytics. I'm just going to do a quick summary there. You will have these on PDF as well, so you can go back to them. But just know that everything is an event in GA4. Some events are automatically collected. Recommended events are ones that you can configure yourself, and enhanced measurements will give you a good starting base for collecting more event data, but may need additional configuration, despite Google saying it shouldn't. So in summary, you're used to events having category action label. I've used the navigation one here before. GA4, the equivalent would be your event name of navigation. Parameter would be navigation underscore name, and the value will be click text. And navigation underscore URL will be another parameter that I add to that, and that would be the click URL, and that will give me the page I'm sending a user through to. I could have another one in there of refer a URL if I wanted. So what page was someone on before they triggered the event? That would help me understand if people are going to a page and then going, this isn't what I'm looking at, so I need to see where people are going into the navigation from there. It's a lot more flexible. It does require a different methodology when thinking about your events, but these parameters are just designed to give you more information about what's happening when the events are triggered. You can have up to 25, 5 are reserved, so it's really 20. If you need help with events or working them out, what we do recommend is you create an Excel sheet. Very basic, I know, it's not glamorous, but if you specify your URL there, specify your parameters, the parameters can be reused. So navigation name may be something that's used for a header. If I had a header navigation event, it could also be used for a footer navigation event. I wouldn't need to create an additional parameter if I've already got one there that works for it. So you don't want to create an endless list of parameters that are going to overwhelm you. But if you have all of those available in a Excel spreadsheet, you can see which ones are reusable based on the name and the value that you've assigned them. And as I've banged on about more than enough times already, everything is now an event in GA4. Okay, so we're going to look at some changes that you need to know about. So these aren't specific to configuration or admin settings or the data collection model. They're just things you really need to know before you start digging into GA4 itself. One is data limits. So in Universal Analytics, you had a couple of data limits per property, per user, and per session. GA4 doesn't work in quite the same way. It uses a queuing system. So because Google's moved to an entirely event-based system with GA4, it knows that the amount of events going to be fired through its servers and systems is going to be considerably higher than the amount of hits and users that are going through in the old way. It means there is a less of a load on Google servers, the way the new queuing system works, but there are some limitations. One of the things being there can be a delay in collecting data. So it can take 24 to 48 hours for some data to pull through. It can be shorter if you've got a smaller number of events being triggered in your account. What I would say is you will never see today's data in the reports. So when you do look at the reports, it's not going to be a true reflection of how today's doing. You want to see real-time data, you have to go to your real-time view or your debug view. And it's probably best to give yourself 24 to 48 hours before taking the numbers in the reports. So again, in Universal Analytics, those were your data limits there. In GA4, there's no real limits to the data outside of the timing and the timing delay of 24 to 48 hours, but there are limits to the number of event parameter names, values, parameters you can add, and the custom text and definitions you create. Goals is another big change. So in Universal Analytics, you could create goals for different user interactions. You could have things like destination. So if a user lands on a particular page, typically that would be a thank you page. Duration, so if people spend X amount of time on the site before leaving. Pages per visit, useful to understand if people are spending enough time on your site. And then you've got event goals. So jumping back quite a few slides, create events with the event category action label, and you could turn those events into goals for the site, and they would be things you would mark as conversions. Unsurprisingly, all of those goals don't exist anymore. They are all now custom events. You can still create events for destination goals. So you could create an event for a purchase or lead generation. You could also create a conversion if people are spending X amount of time on your blogs, for instance. Or you could also measure different user types depending on how engaged they are on site. But again, it's an event. So while goals themselves have disappeared, you can still create them. It depends on the tagging configuration you do in Tag Manager. They are all now events. You can mark them as conversions in GA4 itself, which is handy, but you need to be mindful of what is actually worth a conversion in GA4 itself. Now, users definition is quite a bit different from Universal Analytics. So total users is exactly as it sounds. It's the total number of users, and it was the primary user metric in Universal Analytics. It's no longer the case for GA4. It does still track the total users, but it's not the primary user metric. The primary user metric for GA4 is what's called active users. And an active user is a user who has an engaged session, or when Analytics collects the first visit, first open, or the user engagement time parameter from the site or app that's being fired. You do get new users though as well. They're classed as someone who has an active user who has no previous sessions. Probably the one thing to note there is if people don't accept cookies on the site, they're going to be seen as having no previous sessions. They're using iOS. It's likely that they're likely to have 0 previous sessions unless they log in or they or unless you've turned on Google Signal to capture their data that way. Active users, from my perspective, is quite a good metric. I think it's useful to count the users who are deemed to have more than 10 seconds on site, have viewed 2 or more pages, or have triggered a conversion event. So if you start thinking more about GA4, it's trying to help you better understand who is engaged with your site, and then giving you the metrics that are going to help you report on them. I would lean more towards pushing the business to report on active users. I'm not saying you wouldn't report on new or total, but knowing who's active and how many are active is quite a positive business metric. And that's just a summary there of active users being the new primary dimension instead of total. One of the other things that's changed in GA4 compared to Universal Analytics is the concept of page views. So in Universal Analytics, page view will be the number of views a page has received on site. If the person refreshes or navigates away from a page and comes back, that will be counted as multiple page views. But you used to have a metric called unique page views, where it would just track single instances from the same user. So if, as a user, I viewed the same page 4 times, unique page view metric would just measure it once. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist anymore. Views are the only metric you get. You don't get unique page views. So it's just the page of the site, identical to page view, and the metric you're familiar with. It's a different name. You can see views per user, which will help, but you're not going to get unique page views anymore. As we've covered there, unique page views no longer exists. You have views, which is the total number of app screens. Again, remember, GA4 is built with apps and websites in mind. You will see that noted in the reporting interface on the second session in particular, but it can be a combination of page views and screen views. So if you have a data stream for your website and an app, views will be a combination of both per user. Okay, sessions. We've touched on this quite a bit throughout and how they're not truly comparable. So in GA3, Universal Analytics, data was generally grouped by sessions. Sessions are the foundations of a lot of reporting, and that's been the case for decades. We've always used sessions. It's a good benchmark for counting how many people are coming to the site and starting to store their user interactions. Session could be page views, it could be events, transactions, or the different types of hits available. And a session can have multiple hits. In GA4, you can still see session data, but it's different. As we covered right at the start, GA4 is an entirely different data model. The way it collects session data is now a session is an event. So the way it's processing the data, the way it's storing those is entirely different. And for this reason, I would say you don't want to be comparing the sessions in GA4 to Universal Analytics. Different data models, they're not comparable, and it won't help you. For lots of our clients, we've set up Google Analytics for more than 6 months ago, so that there is session data being populated to give us look-back windows. If you haven't set up GA4 yourself yet, if you've not done it, I would recommend getting it set up now, so you've at least got a month's worth of session data you can look back to. Because it's all an event, you just can't compare it with Universal Analytics. If you try to, you will see that the numbers are different, and it can vary between 0 to 8% variance, sometimes up to 20%, depending on the filters you've got applied. Right back at the beginning, we talked about one of the data filtering options, or two data filtering options, internal and developer traffic. GA4 only gives you those two options out of the box. In Universal Analytics, you could apply much more filtering. It's not the case in GA4. So if you try and compare them, keep in mind that there's going to be various reasons why it won't be comparable and why the numbers won't be similar. So as I mentioned, session counts in them both are different and not comparable. Are sessions still useful? Yes, but what I would say is sessions should no longer be a SEO objective or necessarily be used as the sole metric for acquisition. And that's because of two new changes for acquisition. And although they're still metric, there are two things to look at in GA4. There are two categories. One is user acquisition. So this is going to be looking at the first traffic source that led a user to your site. So it's going to be reporting on the number of new users and how engaged they were. The other report is traffic acquisition, and that's going to be reporting on the most recent traffic source that started that session. So you might be used to using sessions as your acquisition tool, your acquisition metric, but you need to now be in the mindset of there are two types of acquisition you're going to need to report on, one being user, one being traffic. Now, in the second session we go through this in much more detail, but I'll just go through these top line now for everyone. This report is a user acquisition report in GA4. It's not too dissimilar for what you'll be used to seeing in the fact that there's a table view. You've got a primary dimension where you can see first user default channel group, by secondary dimension, and then you've got a number of metric headers here. Now, in user acquisition, you have a couple of new metrics. Oh, sorry, there we go. You've got new users, which is the number of people who've interacted with your site or launched the app for the first time. You have engaged sessions, so it's the number of sessions that lasted longer than 10 seconds, had a conversion event, or they viewed 2 or more screens or page views. Screens will be if it's an app, page views if it's a website. You also get engagement rate, which is the percentage of engaged sessions, and that's worked out by engaged sessions divided by the total number of sessions. That's why you don't see sessions in the user acquisition report. You get engaged sessions per user, so how many of your users had an engaged session. And then you also get engagement time. So this is the average length of time that the app was in the foreground of your phone or the website was the focus in the browser. That's a really good metric because it's focusing more on the fact that the web page with the app view is actually active and not just sat in a background tab. You get event count, which could be useful, but remember everything in GA4 is an event. So sessions, page views, that's just going to count the total number of events. And then if you mark a conversion, you can see the amount of conversions that each user by default channel grouping has been generated. So user acquisition is one report. The second is traffic acquisition. So traffic acquisition, as I said, will be when people are generating another session, the most recent session that comes to the site. So users is the total number of active users, and it's anyone who's collected an engaged session. Sessions is going to be the number of sessions generated. So if you want your session metric, you're only going to find it in the traffic acquisition report. You do get your engaged sessions in here as well. So you can see the total number of sessions, but you can also see the number of engaged sessions. So if a session doesn't last over 10 seconds, a user only views a single page, or they don't commit to a conversion event, it'll be counted in the sessions, but not engaged sessions. You get your engagement time per session, engaged sessions per user, events per session, and engagement rate as well. You can change these columns if you wanted to. We'll look at that in the next session. But just keep in mind, there are two ways to report on measuring acquisition. It's no longer just going to be using the session metric. What you need to be doing is considering your user acquisition, what drove those users to your site, and then your session acquisition as your second metric. It'll vary. I appreciate, and we have this conversation with lots of clients ourselves, that this is a different way of thinking. Sessions has been a default metric that we've used for decades. And now there are different metrics to consider. I would say things like engaged sessions is probably a better metric, but communicating that back through business is going to be something that needs to be starting now if it hasn't already happened. We touched on before about what constitutes an engaged session, and we said there it was a session duration of 10 seconds or longer. You can change that if you wish. So if you go into your admin day stream settings, show all, you have an option called adjust session timeout. So traditionally, a session would time out automatically after 30 minutes, and an engaged session is set by default to trigger as engaged after 10 seconds. You can change those yourself if you wish. If you feel like 30 minutes is too long or too short, that very much depends on what the business KPIs are for your site. You may want to extend or decrease that. And for an engaged session, if you're producing a lot of long form content on your site, or you have a site with very minimal content and you're just driving people to fill in a form, you may wish to change those as well. Again, I would choose to make those decisions before the changeover in July. So to wrap up on sessions, it shouldn't be a base metric anymore. They're counted differently. It's not comparable. They will still be, they will continue after midnight rather than restart or when new campaign parameters are triggered. So if you are operating in multiple countries, what you could find is session numbers may be inflated as people cross different time zones. Again, why you want to set your time zone to your primary country in the settings. But you can also change that 30-minute window, which is similar to Universal Analytics there as well. I would recommend considering engaged sessions as a more positive metric to consider. Sessions is fine. Engaged sessions is better. One of the other ones we get asked about quite a lot is a old favorite, bounce rate. So bounce rates didn't transfer over to Google Analytics 4 to begin with, and a bounce was a single page session with no interaction. So it could be that you have a blog post or you have a long form piece of content, but if they don't go anywhere after that piece of content, it will be considered a bounce. Now, it would help you understand if users were engaged with your site, but as we've touched on, as we've gone through today's session, there are better metrics for measuring engagement. In saying that, marketers created their own reports which worked out the bounce rate in the Explore section. And late last year, Google brought bounce rate back. You won't see it in any of the base reports. You have to manually add it in. And it's not calculated in the same way. So if you were using bounce rate as a metric to measure how people were engaging with your site, it's not comparable anymore. As we mentioned before, engagement rate is measuring the amount of people who have a session that lasts longer than 10 seconds, 2-page views, or a conversion event. bounce rate is now just the inverse of that. So if you have an engagement rate of 80%, your bounce rate will just be 20%. I would say probably focus more on the positive new metric of engagement rate. I would expect the bounce rate will end up disappearing due to lack of usage as Google tries to push people back through to engagement rate instead. So bounce rate was there, but it's disappeared. I think if you start getting used to the idea of engagement rate instead of bounce, it's going to be beneficial for you. And then lastly, we've touched on this before, but it's just worth putting it on the slide so you've got the reference point there for you. Engaged sessions and engagement rate. They're the new metrics in GA4, and they'll help you better understand what's working. Engaged session, as I've said multiple times already, is one that lasts 10 seconds or more. You can change that if you wish. Have 2 page views, or views as they're now called, and at least 1 conversion event. You could have multiple conversion events for it to trigger, but it's at least 1. And engagement rate is the measure of how many sessions for the primary dimension you've selected were engaged. They're much better metrics to be using, but here's a business shift you need to consider, because a lot of the metrics you've used for the previous decade, if not longer, have been depreciated in GA4. And that is everything. So are there any questions anyone wants to ask at this point? I'll put my email in the chat window if you want to email myself and Steve separately. You should have that there. So we do have one question from Kevin, the recommended events. Recommended events are something you need to configure yourself, but you can do that through Google Tag Manager. You create the event's name, then you add the parameters that you wish to collect with that event. You will have the 5 automatically collected parameters, so the page URL, the referral path, and page title, as well as screen resolution. And I've forgotten the last one, but there is a 5th one there. So it doesn't have to be coded as such. You can do it through Tag Manager if you have Tag Manager set up for your site. And then I would just get a developer or whoever's doing that for you to run it through Debug View to make sure it's pulling in the information you wish to see before setting it live. Hopefully that answers the question on that one. Are there any other questions or anything anyone else wants to ask at this point? Lot of transactions not tracked in any way. Is that something that will be better in GA4? Okay, that's a interesting question. If you have transactions not being tracked, that would indicate that there's a configuration issue between the tracking. So if you have an event from Tag Manager to fire transactions into your Universal Analytics account, it's possibly not configured correctly. It could be better in GA4, but without seeing how they're being collected, I wouldn't be able to say. If you want to send myself and Steve an email, we'll be able to see if we can help answer that question for you in more detail. Any other questions from anyone else? Nope. Okay. The second session will be in 2 weeks' time. I think everyone's got the notification for that. That session is all about the reporting interface and how to navigate through the reports, where you'll find some of the information you found in Universal Analytics, how to find some of the details, some tips and tricks, and how to change some of the reports. Cool. Kevin, I'll come back to that one in a moment, just as I finish wrapping up here. We'll make sure you get a recording of this session as well, along with the slides. Do feel free to email myself or Steve directly. And Kevin, I will respond to you separately in a chat window now. And then if you want to ping me an email, I can help answer that for you as well. If there's no other questions though, thank you everyone for your time. Hope you found today's session useful, and I look forward to seeing you on the next session in 2 weeks. Thanks a lot, everyone.